introduce now Dr. Evan Gora, who's in another office at Carey Institute. Hey, Evan. So let me just give you a little bit of a bio. Evan did his PhD at the University of Louisville. I pronounced that correctly?
Louisville. We slur it well there.
George Pickett, one of our scientists and urban ecologists, is from Louisville, and we just see George Perkins from Louisville. Evan is a Carey Research Fellow, and he has a joint appointment, a dual appointment, as the Earl S. Tupper Postdoctoral Fellow at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. Evan likes to look, and he's going to talk about lightning tonight, but fundamentally, Evan's interest is, why do big trees die? And particularly, why do big trees die in the tropics? It's been a great pleasure to have Evan at Carey Institute. He's worked all over Latin America and new projects starting in Africa. He was recently in Rwanda and some parts in North America. Anyway, let us begin our conversation. And Evan, why don't you tell us a bit more about who you are? And as it were, a nice farm boy from the Midwest ended up as a tropical ecologist.
Yeah. Thanks for the nice introduction, Josh. So, as you said, I grew up on a small semi-functional farm, actually only about 4 hours from here in Appalachian, Pennsylvania. And my mom was a town vet. So spent a lot of time running around bare feet on a farm or sitting on a stool in the operating room at my mom's vet hospital, which really early on developed a deep interest in biology, nature, really at large. It wasn't until I was in undergrad, though, that I learned anything about ecology. So my sophomore year, I was taking chemistry courses, economics courses. I really had no idea what I wanted to do, but those things were interesting. And I had a friend convince me to sign up for a course called ecology. And I'm pretty sure I didn't know what the word meant. But they said it would be great. I signed up, and a few weeks in, I realized that some of the things we were learning were actually things that the professor had discovered, and they were some of their papers. And I had not until that moment realized that, this was a job. You could, get paid to understand how the world works. And, I started down that path, and it wasn't too much longer. I realized, not only do you get paid to figure out how the world works, but that work has a real impact. You can figure out, how our natural world functions so that we use it correctly and we live with it in a way that sort of benefits us and also benefits its nature. And those experiences really got me down the path of studying ecology. And it was sort of, as I was leaving undergrad, I learned about this opportunity to do research in Panama. And that's sort of what got me to the tropics.
Well, and I always like to say to people, being a tropical ecologist, I'm a tropical ecologist who does wildlife biology in the past, but being a tropical ecologist gives you an excuse to go almost anywhere in the world, right? And so tell us, where have you used this excuse to your benefit, and where are you doing your research now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I work in quite a few places, but I'll start off with a place that's near and dear to my heart. It's actually what you're seeing in the video right here. This is a place called Barro Colorado Island. It's in central Panama, actually inside the canal zone. So the Panama Canal has a big lake, and this is dead center in it. That site right there is the oldest field station in the tropics. Its birthday is actually next year. If you end up in DC in about a month over the next year, you can pop over to an exhibit that highlights some of the work that me and my colleagues are doing, actually. This site that you're looking at, I actually lived at for a little over 3 years. It's an amazing place to be because the amount of research that's there and the amount of people who come through. 1,500 people come visit every year, scientists from other places. You get to meet them, learn about what they're doing. And this has really been this test bed for building these ideas about what kills big trees. So I've done a lot of work here, and then what we've learned in this forest and questions that were generated here, we're now traveling out to Colombia, Brazil. We have a few projects now going on in Central Africa with some incipient projects in Gabon and also Southeast Asia, trying to understand more about what kills trees, particularly in tropical forests. Now, the reason I'm interested in tropical forests, and there are many of us who are, so it's actually, dozens of researchers from 17 different countries who I collaborate with on these projects. We're interested in tropical forests because they're disproportionate impact. So tropical forests are 10% of land area. There's not that much of them, but there's 60% of the biomass carbon stored on our planet. So what happens to these forests has a huge impact, not just on those countries in the tropics, but on our whole planet. They're really the lungs of the planet, and we're trying to figure out how to keep them healthy.
Great. And one of the things that I think is interesting is you've said several times that you like to study large trees. So I'm curious, what's so special about big trees? Obviously, there are fewer of them, but they're bigger. And why do you focus on them?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of reasons. They really come down to these vital roles that just a few individuals can play in an ecosystem. So it might be kind of surprising, but just the largest 1% of the trees in a patch of forest have about half of the above ground biomass, and that means half of the carbon in that biomass. So just a few trees have a huge impact on how biomass and carbon go in and out of these ecosystems. Now, also because these trees are so large, they have a really big impact on the survival of the species that they're a part of. So when we think about, reproduction in humans and how big humans are, the biggest human is maybe 3 times your size. Everybody can have kids at about the same rate. And those things just aren't true about trees. So the biggest tree in a forest is about 1,000 times bigger than the average tree, which is like a mind-boggling thing to imagine, but it's because these trees can keep growing throughout their lifetime, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And when they get to be super enormous, they end up contributing like the vast majority of the reproduction. So if you just kill a few of the really big individuals, you can fundamentally change the trajectory of that species, into the future. So it can have a huge impact, just a few individuals. And then because these trees are so big, they don't just affect themselves or this ecosystem service in terms of carbon, but they affect all the other organisms in that forest. So all the beetles, the ants, the birds, the monkeys, they'll actually rely on a few of these really big trees to provide fruits and leaves for them to eat. And the impact of just a tiny number of individuals is really quite staggering. And we're really interested in what's happening to the death of these trees, because all these services are available because these trees are living. So when they die, this removes these services or can change how they're provided to the ecosystem. And that death is really important. So we're benefiting as people because of the amount of carbon that tropical forests have been taking up over the past 150 years. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've emitted tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which I'm sure you know. People don't always know that a huge amount of that, about like maybe 30%, has been soaked up by tropical forests, which is really protecting us from ourselves. And the ability of forests to do this seems to be declining. So when we go to places like the Amazon rainforest, we're seeing that trees are dying more often. And because they're dying more often, those forests aren't capturing carbon like they used to. And some of them actually seem to be emitting carbon now because those trees are dying more and more. And we don't know what kills them. So a really driving question in my research program is trying to understand what kills trees, and particularly these really big ones that have all these big impacts that I was just describing.
Well, and I think what's interesting to me is, I hadn't thought of this before, but if you think about, people talk about forest restoration. And of course, if these trees are, you said, 500 to a couple thousand years old, do we really know the age of them, or?
No, we don't. There's a whole interesting story to that. Yeah.
Okay, you were waffling on that. Maybe we'll get back to that. But fundamentally, when we restore forests, that's wonderful. But they don't have the same carbon absorptive capacity as these intact forests with these huge trees in them. So if they're dying, why is it so hard to study them and figure out why they're dying?
Yeah, so first and foremost, there aren't that many of the big trees. So that's our first big challenge. There aren't many big trees out there to study. So it's 1%. So we're ignoring 99% first because that 1% has all these big contributions. And they don't die that often. As Josh just asked, they can live for hundreds of years. On average, 1 or 2% of that 1% die every year. So we're trying to study those. It's already getting down to a very small number of trees. Now, they don't all die from the same thing. So when we want to study them, we need to look at a bunch of them that died from a bunch of different causes. So maybe even if we pretended there were only 6 things that happened, we're dividing that by 6 again. So we're getting down to an even smaller number. And then when you go to the tropics, the diversity of the trees is staggering. So for example, there's a place I work in Colombia called Amaquiacu. It's down on the Amazon River, really gorgeous, beautiful place. There's a plot of land that's about 500 yards by 500 yards. It's a little square. It has 1,300 tree species in it. That's more than North America, all of it. So if you're trying to understand what's killing these trees, and you need to have a bunch of trees that are killed by the same factor of the same species, you're running out of trees really fast. And we typically study forests in an area that's about 100 meters by 100 meters, and it's just 100 yards by 100 yards. It's just not big enough. So what we're trying to do is basically study these processes at an unprecedented scale. So we can basically, map where all these trees are dying over huge, huge areas, go out in the forest and figure out what's going on. Oh, Josh, you're muted.
See, I didn't want it to echo because we discovered earlier that it echoes, so I keep muting. Thank you, Evan. Right? You mentioned earlier that one cause was lightning. So let me just ask sort of a two-part question. First, why are you studying lightning as a driver of large tree death? And then, now I'll get to the question in the proper format. And how old are these trees, and does lightning preferentially go for the bigger, older trees? All right. So why don't we make that? You can take that in any way you'd like.
Sure, yeah. So I guess the really simple answer to why study lightning is there are a lot of lightning strikes that hit tropical forests, a lot. So there were about 50 million lightning strikes that hit tropical forests and another 50 million that hit other tropical ecosystems, a lot of those being savannas or woodlands that have a lot of trees too. So millions and millions of lightning strikes hitting all the time. We also know that climate change is changing weather patterns, and it seems to be creating more and more intense storms. And this is going to be producing, more lightning strikes as well. So we need to understand, what lightning is doing now to have any idea what a change in lightning frequency might do in the future. And it can have these big effects in these forests because of how frequent it's happening. Now, as for how old these trees are, so lightning, we think it might be hitting and killing a lot of these big trees. This is, why we're interested in it. It's a cause of large tree death. And part of the challenge of figuring out its role is actually that it's really hard to know how old these trees are. So when you hear a lot about, trees being really old, or, anyone in the audience who might think about, I hear that this sequoia is really old, or you might hear about these bristlecone pines that are really old. There's some trees in Australia that are spectacularly old, 2, 3, 4,000 years old. What a lot of those have in common is they're located in countries with a lot of money to study how old trees are. Interestingly, we have tiny bits of information about how old trees can get in the tropics, and it suggests they can get really, really old. So I can tell a little anecdote. There were some researchers a few years ago who went to a lumber mill in the central Amazon. And they just went to a few of the big trees and took little samples of wood from the center, because you can't count tree rings in the tropics. Lots of reasons they grow a lot. It's not how we do date them. So you basically need to carbon date the center of the tree to know how old it is. And those trees, so they didn't just go find the oldest tree in the forest. They just went to a lumber mill, grabbed some big ones that day, were as old as 1,500 years old. And we don't really have systematic studies of how old trees are in the tropics. So it's likely there are many of these.
Did they use carbon dating when they took the core from the
Exactly.
tree?
Yeah. So they basically take a chunk of wood from the dead center, and then they measure how old it is with carbon dating. And that is how you date those trees, because they don't have rings. And 1,500 years old with just a random sample of a handful of trees in a lumber mill, we know there are older trees out there, and we know we're just scratching the surface. So they might be living a really tremendously long time.
All right. So what happens when a lightning strike hits? Obviously we've seen, people seen trees on the roadside in the backyard with a branch off or split down the middle, but in a tropical forest with these huge trees, what is the process by which lightning affects those trees?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's the answer is surprising. So in general, and this is what we were thinking when we were starting this work, and most people, particularly if you're from somewhere like the US, you're going to think about lightning causing a fire. It's a really important thing that lightning will do out west with huge negative consequences. You might think about lightning blowing a tree to little pieces, which is charismatic and cool, but it doesn't really happen very often. Or if you know a little more about lightning, you might be aware of the lightning scars, so these little spiraling strips of bark removed from trees. These are things we typically associate with lightning because they're easy to see. These are not things that really happen in tropical forests, which is fascinating. So instead, what we see when lightning strikes hit tropical forests is that they attach to a canopy tree. So the lightning bolt comes down, attaches to this really big tree, and then it flows out its branches to its neighbors. So you can see in the image here, you have these two really large trees, and one of these is attached to, and lightning actually flows outward to its neighbor, and it'll flow outward to the neighbors in the periphery too, and it'll zap the trees around its trunk, and it actually creates this sort of group of standing damaged and dead trees. And on average, a lightning strike kills 5.5 trees and damages 18.1. So 23 trees affected per strike. And that's an average. So we have strikes that we've tracked down and identified where 116 trees were electrocuted and damaged. And that's not counting for the trees that get crushed and tumble and fall as all this falls apart. So, this little patch of forest can have a huge effect from an individual lightning strike that just lasts a millisecond, which is pretty spectacular. And not only does it affect big groups of trees, it differentially affects the biggest trees. So we've done modeling work, and it's pretty logical. You'd expect the lightning is going to hit the tallest thing around, and it hits the trees that are tallest and the trees with the biggest crowns, which coincidentally are the trees that have the most biomass in the forest. So it's a dominant cause of death for the largest, most important trees in any patch of forest. And this has major effects on carbon dynamics in forests. It causes that carbon to then leave the ecosystem and return back to the atmosphere. So we're really just fundamentally interested in how lightning affects the function of these forests, particularly in terms of carbon, because of these big damage events it causes.
Right. You might have noticed I stopped muting myself so that we don't have that problem again. You showed a really nice drone video of what we finally call BCI, Colorado Island, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. We saw some pictures of you hanging off a tree on belay, right? But what other technologies, or maybe those are the technologies, but the world is changing really quickly, and Moore's law and new satellites and all these things have changed the way science is done. And I'm curious, what is the role of technology in because these trees are really tall and really big.
Yeah. So we wouldn't be able to do anything we do. We wouldn't know the things we know without modern technology. So in addition to all the issues we talked about before of studying really big trees, studying lightning presents a new suite of problems. So we can't predict where lightning is going to hit, and we can't really find it after it's happened. We have a lot of trouble with that. Now, we have developed over the last few years, our group, methods to identify lightning strikes in the field. But the problem with those is the evidence of them decomposes in a few months. So if you're going to find all these strikes, and some of them look different than others, you'd have to just be walking tremendous areas in the forest all the time trying to find this evidence, and it's just not feasible. So we've been able to overcome this using a combination of drones, electromagnetic sensor arrays, and satellites. And we sort of put these together in sequence. So we have some collaborators at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, who are atmospheric physicists, and they have sort of invented and put together these arrays of sensors. So basically we, and I use the royal we here because I'm not very important to this aspect of the work, take these sensors out and we can put them in an array, for example, around all of central Panama. And they record radio waves coming off of lightning strikes. So basically this huge pulse of energy that comes off a lightning strike looks like nothing else. So these sensors pick up those pulses, and then they can basically match those pulses up because they have a very specific fingerprint. And then we can figure out where they came from based on when they hit every sensor. And we use that to go out in the forest and find those lightning strikes. And, it can be a huge pain, even though if you know where it is, to actually find all the damage. So we use drones to then basically identify exactly which tree it is. And we also use drones to map aspects of the forest to see which trees are dying, where and when, even when it's not from lightning. And then we take all this information and we can learn about this one patch of forests. Now we started in Panama, but we're doing this in other forests as well. And then we combine it with satellite sensors and other plot networks to basically scale up and start figuring out, how, for example, lightning matters to the global carbon cycle. And we're trying to do this not just with lightning, but also other key drivers of tree death. So we really lean on these large collaborative networks with people with super diverse skill sets. And it's a wonder of modern science. We can work with these people all over the world, and it just wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Right. And that sequence of having sensors in the forest and then essentially triangulating off where they hit and when they hit, and therefore you can figure out, like we did with radio telemetry in the old days before we had GPS collars for animals, you can figure out where the lightning was, and then you send in the drone, right? So you're not searching for the proverbial lightning strike in a haystack or the lightning strike in a massive forest. So lightning, you talked about it affecting, on average, I think it was 23 trees in a single strike. Obviously, the impact on the trees is variable, and it doesn't kill all of those trees. Is there anything good about lightning strikes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a question I often get when I'm talking about this is sort of, is lightning a bad thing? Is it bad that we have lightning? And not really. So lightning's natural. It existing isn't bad. What can be scary is when the amount of lightning we have changes and maybe our forests aren't ready for it. So we know lightning can actually be potentially good for some species. So we know some species survive lightning strikes. This is work we just published a few weeks ago. And we're wrapping up some other work right now suggesting that some might actually benefit from being struck by lightning, because those lightning strikes will hit a large canopy tree that survives without damage, but it kills their neighbors and it kills their parasitic lianas. So it might actually be good for those trees because these other organisms competing with it are being knocked out while it's doing pretty well. But there is a bad component. Not all of them are surviving. You can see right here in the center, those trees aren't doing so great. So lightning kills tens of millions of these super large, super important trees every year. So for those trees, lightning is obviously bad. And for those ecosystems, if that's what lightning is typically doing, it could result in a decrease in the amount of carbon those forests can store. And the large amounts of biodiversity those trees are supporting, might be in trouble. If we basically are decreasing the large trees, decreasing the biomass in the forest, that can have cascading effects on everything else there. So our big unknown is really how these two forces play out. Can forests sort of acclimate to a potential change in lightning frequency? What I mean by that is if lightning is killing these trees that can't survive lightning strikes, but not the ones that can, you might actually have a shift in your forest. So maybe in the short term, you have less carbon, but you might just shift to a different composition. So that forest might still provide those key services with just a slight shift in sort of the relative abundance of the different organisms. Right. Or if those trees aren't abundant enough, you have less of them and you have these negative consequences. And we don't know really what that balance is going to be.
Right. And as a wildlife biologist, I know there's a huge literature on how animals disperse tropical forest seeds. And so if you have these cascading effects and your really big fruiting trees don't support as many monkeys, don't support as many birds, then there aren't the number of things to move those seeds around, and you could have an impact on the next generation of that species. So, and as you said, those really big trees produce most of the seeds. So yep. That's phenomenal. So inevitably, right? You can't, I like to say that we don't study climate change. Climate change is an overriding factor in ecology in the 21st century. And so I'm sort of curious, what's the future of lightning strikes and what's its relationship to climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question. And really at the core of our interests in trying to figure out, the implications of this in the long term. So we know that lightning strikes are an atmospheric phenomenon. And it seems like they're actually going to be, increasing in the future. And we can even go to places like Central Africa, that's already a lightning hotspot. It gets, some of the highest lightning strike frequencies in the world in the Congo Basin, second biggest tract of forest in the world. And existing studies suggest that lightning frequency in this area might have gone up by as much as 20% since 1990. And 20% might not sound that big. I mean, that's a staggering change. Imagine if there were 20%, more, branches falling and hitting your house now than 10 years ago. You would notice that. That'd be a big change. So this is a big increase. And this is something that's not just happening in tropical forests, happening in temperate regions as well. So some pretty robust work suggesting that lightning frequency in the eastern US, so around here in New York, is increasing 25 to 50% by 2100. So huge increases in lightning frequency in a lot of regions. And this can have major implications. So if lightning's increasing, as we mentioned, it might cause a decrease in our forest carbon or forest function, or a shift in the organisms living there. But to understand what's actually going to happen, we need to understand what lightning is doing now, and then understand which species can survive, and then start to project that into the future. And that's the work we're developing right now. And this work is really important to guiding how we manage our existing forests, and then also shaping how we might reforest. So if we want to plant a forest to grow, for the future, you might be inclined to plant trees that are going to grow really fast right now. But if they're the same trees that are going to die before they can become really big because they can't survive lightning or whatever other factor it is, then you're not planting a healthy forest. You're sort of setting that forest up to fail, and that's not what we want to do. So we need to understand, how these forests succeed, how these big trees succeed to make this big healthy forest, so that we can have sort of the right structure and the right composition of our forest going forward. And we can use that to guide, even things like correct logging decisions. Do we log this patch or the other based on how, resilient that patch might be to future climate?
All right, I'm going to sneak another question in before I go to the next slide. You've got these sort of, we think of people chasing tornadoes, right? And you're sort of a lightning chaser. And the forests, some of these tropical forests are absolutely huge. So what's the scale you're working at, and how does that change across Panama, Congo, other parts of Central Africa, and other places where you're working in Brazil, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it sort of depends on the precise question we're asking, but we really work across scales from an individual tree, from that tree's anatomy, all the way up to the entire tropics. But something we're really advancing right now are these efforts to basically use drones to, on a really high frequency, map every single tree and be able to actually map its photosynthetic capacity, so basically its health across an area that's about 1,000 hectares. So that's like 10 square kilometers. What would that be in square miles?
Uh,
Seven,
6.
six? Okay,
Is that right? You keep thinking, I'll think it's 2.2.
sure. Well, a very big area, and we
Yeah.
basically map every single tree, and then we can use essentially computer algorithms to tell us, which tree is not doing so well. And we can actually have people go out in the forest and, look at that tree, figure out what's going on, and we simultaneously in the same area will track the lightning strikes, see what they're hitting. We'll be able to do monitoring of things like tree response to wind or drought or soil moisture. So we're trying to set up sort of these sentinel sites where we can track what's actually killing the big trees. And then we use those data to work with some of our colleagues, distributed across other institutes, including people working with NASA, use satellite data to try to scale up to larger scales and see what's happening to the planet in general.
So how many square kilometers were you at?
10 square kilometers.
It's about 4. All right,
Four,
it's
okay.
just under a division of 3. I checked before I said anything again. So that's really interesting. One of the things people always ask, so we always preempt the question because we know people are going to ask. We've heard a lot from you about how these things are dying, why they're so important, how restoration is important, and how you do that restoration can change over time. And another colleague of ours at Carey Institute, Sarah Batterman, has done some great work at Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and other places looking at the carbon consequences of the decisions you make on which trees to plant. But fundamentally, the question people always say, well, I'm not a tropical ecologist. I'm not going to go to Panama or Brazil or Central Africa. So what can I do to help? Right? How can I affect this problem? Because I also am not really good at reducing lightning strikes.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. So what the work I do is really, helping guide sort of larger scale efforts that don't affect people's everyday habits, but there are everyday things you can do to actually have a pretty substantial impact. So a lot of people probably hear, you should reduce your carbon footprint, offset that, and there are a ton of different ways you could go about that. I'm not going to go through a whole list, but I want to highlight 2 that are really actually very simple and very easy and very accessible. And I think that's helpful. It's like, figuring out how to go to the gym. It's like, well, if I just go every Tuesday, I might actually start showing up. So one big thing you can do is just eat less beef. So it's something we don't really realize. You'll be told, meat is bad in general or something like that. But not all meat is created equally. So even if you still want to eat meat, you still want to, be an omnivore, that's okay. But if you ate chicken instead of eating beef, even half the time, it has an enormous, enormous impact on your carbon footprint. It's kind of staggering how much more carbon is emitted through beef production, both as a function of land area use and in the actual cows themselves relative to something like chicken. So even just that tiny shift can have a huge impact. It could cut your carbon footprint by a double digit huge percent, 20% or something like that. Don't quote me on the number, but it's surprising. And then also palm oil. So this is one we don't really think about a lot. And it's very far from home, but Southeast Asian rainforests are being absolutely decimated by palm oil plantations. And this is spreading also particularly to the neotropics, to Brazil and places like that. But palm oil is something that appears in a ton of products, and it is sort of pervasive because it's very cheap. But how palm oil works is they go in and they cut down the entire tract of tropical forest and just plant palm oil. And that's it. That's what's living there. So instead of 1,300 tree species in that patch of forest, you have palm oil. You don't have the big trees. You don't have all these functions. You don't have all this carbon storage. And if it's anything like all the other times we've done this in forests, like bananas and whatnot, it's going to eventually get a disease and it's all going to die anyway. So we're sort of destroying this forest that protects us for something we know is going to go badly in the next few decades anyway. So it's if you can avoid palm oil and beef, you can have a huge impact just right there. I'd also suggest supporting science, whatever capacity that works for you. Even attending, seminars like this and informing yourself. The really basic research that we do here at the Carey Institute and that I've been talking about today is critical to actually managing our planet for the future. So I think most people, want us to have a healthy planet. We want to have a planet that functions in the future for future generations. And we're figuring out what to do, but there's a lot of work to do still. So supporting basic science can make that possible. And lastly, use your voice. So I've talked a lot about big old trees, and to have big old trees, you need big old forests, and advocating for the protection can be really important. We cut down all the forests in the eastern U.S. 100 years ago, and they're still recovering. So we need to let at least some of these forests recover to be big old forests again for them to function like they should, and they aren't there yet. It takes a lot more than 100 years for a forest to get back to what it was. So, we need to protect these older forests that we have, and let forests that exist actually age to maturity.
Wow. Okay. And no, I didn't ask Evan to make a pitch for supporting Carey Institute. You'll notice he said support science. And I think that's really important. Things like the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute is a federal institution, and making sure that, if you care about these things, when you speak to your elected officials, if you budget process coming up, the National Science Foundation, just so people know, up until very recently, and it got cut out of the Inflation Reduction Act, but there has not been a major increase until recently, except for 2009 in the stimulus package for the NSF budget, right? So we are not spending a lot more on basic science. And so it's sort of a broad problem. So I wanted to ask a couple questions. We have a chance, if you put questions in the Q&A, Lori will send them to me in the chat. That's why we close out the chat. But I wanted to ask a question that came in the registration. So it's a sort of a two-piece question. So one of the things somebody said was, I'm worried that we don't talk enough about the problems that forests are having at home. Right. And I will say we did a really wonderful webinar almost a year ago on forest fires in the West. We can link to that if people want. When we send out the recording, we'll try and put a link to that. I've talked with Charlie Canham about carbon and carbon sequestration in northeastern forests. But I'm going to ask the question relative to this. Are there things that you're learning in tropical forest ecosystems that might be applicable or relevant to temperate or boreal systems or other forests in terms of the impact of lightning or the things that kill big trees?
Yeah, and I guess to touch on the first question too, it's interesting that we do hear a lot in the media about research in other places, research in tropical forests and whatnot, and a big reason for that is actually that very few resources are devoted to that. It's staggering how little investment there is in research in tropical places. So they end up highlighted a lot in news and things like that because we're failing essentially to study them. And almost all the investment is done, places around here. And we do have major issues. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar, emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, huge problems that definitely need a lot of attention. And in terms of what we're learning in the tropics, it does apply broadly. So what we learn about these forests affects us, number one, because those forests affect us, because as I mentioned, they're essentially the lungs on our planet. But number two, we're learning a lot of things there that might affect what we're going to actually understand about our own forests here. So I mentioned earlier how different sort of our lightning strikes appear in tropical forests. We're pretty sure that they're not different, that it does the same things up here and we just miss it. So if you go back and read papers that people wrote when you could still just sort of, in the literature, just describe, I saw this is what lightning strikes looked like in the 20s and the 30s, you see tons of observations like what we see in the tropics in North America. You see them in Australia, you see them in Great Britain and Europe, lots of descriptions of those types of events. It's very likely that because we assume in general in the US or in Canada that every lightning strike either causes a fire, explosion, or does nothing, that we're missing probably 90% of all the lightning damage. So we're massively underestimating what it's doing. We're not accounting for it. And if it's going to go up 50% in the next few decades, that's a huge hole in our understanding of our forests. And it might have a huge impact on how we manage them, but we're not accounting for it in any way. So we're learning this in the tropics and we're going to apply it here so that we can understand how to manage our forests better too.
So you've talked about, and you just mentioned it, the increasing frequency of lightning. And one of our questions was, is it increasing with climate change? And you've answered that, but they also said, is it increasing with intensity? So we know that the frequency of hurricanes is increasing, but not that much, but we know the intensity is really amplified. Do we get the same phenomenon, or do we know if we'll get the same phenomenon with climate change?
Super good question. We don't know. I really wish I had a great answer for you there. And I have a hunch it varies a lot. So lightning is really complex. It basically is a big static shock, but instead of, you creating static, walking across your carpet and slippers and touching your doorknob, it's actually ice crystals blasting thousands of meters up in the air and back down. It's kind of a ridiculous process, but it's very variable as you go place to place. And I would expect in some places you have more intense lightning. In some places you have more lightning strikes. In other places you have more intense and more lightning strikes. So it'll be a sort of a mishmash, a combination of all of it.
So someone asked, and I think this is a great question, so take a deep breath, think for a second. You talked about your friend who told you to take, said, why don't you take ecology, and how that did it. You mentioned that your mom's a vet. Talk a little bit about, it's a little bit more, I think, less structurally and a little more personally. What was it that really moved you to become a biologist, to become an ecologist? And then also, how do you see the field evolving, and what job opportunities are there? And if a young person, 15 to 20 years old, is high school or early college, and is sort of saying, as you and I realized, people actually pay us to do this, right? It's a remarkable thing. And I had the same reaction. It's like, I'm not going to get paid brilliantly, but I can get paid to do this, right? Won't make what a banker makes, but I get a much richer life. So what was it that inspired you, and what were the sort of, pardon me, roots of your passions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a hard question to answer, because I think there are, as with most things, a lot of intervening factors that combine to sort of develop that passion. I do think a lot of it starts in ways that you don't even recognize when you're a kid. I mean, things I haven't even really recognized till the last couple of years of, so for example, we had chickens when I was growing up. One of my jobs was to go out every morning pretty early and take care of the chickens, collect eggs, that kind of thing. And we ended up being signed up as like a sentinel station for West Nile virus. I'll be honest, I didn't think about that as a thing that existed for probably 15 years. And I think that mattered. Like, I would get up at 5 a.m. as like a little kid, I don't know, probably 10 or 12, because I knew that guy was coming to go check the chickens, and I thought it was really neat. So I would go see him take blood from the chickens, and I didn't really even know what West Nile was. But even at that age, I was fascinated by this person studying chickens for a reason I didn't understand. So I think I had that deep curiosity in just, how do things work? And in finding out that, it's a functional profession that has like a greater purpose to just understand how things work is really what sent me down this path. I don't know if I could really identify a specific instance, but I think it's a deep curiosity in finding a way to really sate that thirst to learn about how things work is really what drives me to do this, and what made me interested in it. It's interesting. I think a lot of people think about becoming a scientist as something where that's for really smart people or something like that. And I don't think that's super true. I mean, I don't think scientists are dumb, but a lot of it is, are you really curious and can you work hard and really pursue a question, even when it's really boring or it's really hard, or like during my dissertation, your experiment catches on fire after 2 years of running it in a drying oven, and you're like, all right, I'm going to do it again. Like those types of things where that curiosity drives you. I think those are the key characteristics that really help you be a scientist and let you love it, even though you aren't paid that well. You're fine, but you're not getting rich.
And I think what's interesting, so several of the things you said resonated deeply, right? I think everybody has had the experience of, in my case, it was baboons breaking into my camp and ripping up bags of zebra dung that I had collected over a 2-year period. There went chapter 3, right? On variation in diet through a drought. Oh, well. But we've all had those setbacks, and I've had 9 PhD students and 23 master's students, and I have 2 observations. One of which is, my best students are often not the people who did straight A's at Ivy League institutions as an undergraduate. They were the people who had B+ averages, often from small liberal arts colleges, and just loved the process, right? Because these setbacks mean that inevitably there are going to be challenges when you do research. And what you set out to do is not always and often is not what you end up doing. And then the second thing is that I like your sort of emphasis on just, as it were, idle curiosity. I mean, how do things work, right? And I think that a lot of people underestimate that. Some people say to us, ecology seems sort of self-obvious, right? You say lightning hits trees and it dies. And it's like, yeah, okay, so lightning kills trees, but it's all those other things, right? It's all the other things that you get to do and great people you get to meet. And I think that's the last thing I'll add to your answer, which is most people would think field ecologists are antisocial human beings. But you've mentioned the 1,500 people who come through Barrow, Colorado. You've mentioned how much you like working with this big group of international scientists. And I think what people need to realize is that it gives you community, right? And it gives you community these days so many different ways. In terms of careers, I think they're increasingly diverse, right? We have so many more tools. You can become a microbiologist, you can become a molecular biologist, you can go out and work in the field. I think there's an increasing need for people who understand restoration ecology and in agricultural systems, in forest systems, freshwater ecology and provisioning. And we get droughts, we have water storage issues. I think farming, right, is becoming, I was hearing about people applying ecological principles. Jane Lucas is applying ecological principles to farming. So I think to answer the second half of the question, which you did in some ways, but there are many, many different things. I'm going to switch back to trees.
Sure. Yeah.
Really interesting question that I hadn't thought of, but is really important, which is you mentioned that some trees acclimate better to lightning strikes, some of them survive it better. Would there be a process as lightning increases? Would the trees be able to keep up, as it were? Could the forest itself acclimate to a new lightning regime?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, in theory, yes, a forest could. That doesn't necessarily mean they're equipped to do so. And there's an interesting dynamic to this is over what time scale. So I would emphatically say yes, all forests can. If we want to think about forests on a forest time scale, so let's think about 10,000 years, 20,000 years. That's not super relevant to us as humans. We are interested in them being able to adapt in the next 30 years, 50 years. And that's why in general, ecologists are worried about climate change is, at the typical scale of change, biota are great. Our forests will do fine, but that rate is so much faster now.
Right.
So I would suspect some forests will be fine, and I would suspect some will not. And what we're trying to do is basically figure out how these different trees respond, where they are, and then be able to figure out, which forests are equipped to handle this and which aren't. So I hope that answers the question. We don't know yet, but we're doing what we need to do to answer that question. And
Right.
there's a cool thing coming out of this work right now where we're basically building models where you could pick a tree, point the tree in your backyard, and we could tell you its likelihood of dying from lightning based on the type of data we're collecting. Now, we're just doing this in a couple sites, but we're basically trying to identify the ways that we could do that really broadly. In that power, being able to be like, all right, what's the likelihood this tree dies from these different factors would make us able to manage our forests appropriately. And that's sort of our ultimate goal is build that type of knowledge that could help us manage these forests.
All right. So we have an ecologist or three in the audience.
Great.
Right? And I'd almost want to accuse Stuart Pickett of asking this question. Stuart is our most senior scientist, distinguished scientist at Carey Institute. Stuart helped found the field of patch ecology and disturbance ecology in forests. And the question is, can lightning be an important driver of disturbance that enhances biodiversity and maybe stability in forest ecosystems?
For sure. And it's probably an important aspect of maintaining diversity in a natural context. So, for example, there's a PhD student who's being advised by my PhD advisor, Stevie Noviak. The student's name is Kane, and he's Kane Lawhorn. He's on BCI right now, actually, right this minute. And he's studying the beetles that show up to these lightning strikes after they happen. Right. And we know in some systems that lightning strikes happen, and these beetles are somehow able to detect them from over a kilometer away. I mean, a beetle's that big. How does it know this lightning strike's a kilometer away? And they fly in, and that's their main resource. So they basically hop from lightning strike to lightning strike across this landscape. And people have done experiments. You can go to the same tree and you can blow it up with detonation cord, same type of damage, but the beetles don't show up. They're somehow able to know, like, this was lightning and I can go eat this tree now. We don't know anything about that in tropical forests, and he's trying to figure that out. But it's an interesting problem of, trying to figure out what organisms might actually rely on these lightning strikes. So in a natural setting, yes, it definitely amplifies diversity. And it's possible that more lightning overall might have positive effects on some organisms and negative effects on others.
Right. Well, that's great. And I think the importance of lightning may be, as you said, changing, right? So one of the things we see in era of climate change is that things that were useful and productive, right, windstorms or hurricanes that cause disturbance, as you said, geological timescale is really important. I was a geologist as an undergrad. 10,000 years, it's nothing, right? We're not going to worry about it. We'll adapt. But on ecological timeframes of hundreds or maybe 1,000 years, because things are happening so much more intensely, and I think one of the things we're trying to figure out is, what's going to happen now. Obviously, cutting carbon emissions, reducing climate, the acceleration of temperature and variation, wild variation in moisture, right? It's going to change that, but I think that's really important. Very sort of detailed question, and it's sort of interesting because it gets into that technology. So it's a sort of two-part question about drones. First of which is, tropical forests are layered and they're dense, and how do you fly a drone through that? And second of all, who trains you to do this? Who is there a route you follow? Does it have an onboard GPS and it tells you where it is and you can see it on a computer? I mean, how does this work? Because people say, oh, you put up a drone like in an open field, sure. But in a multi-storied canopy forest, how do you do this?
It's hard. Yeah, it's a really good question. So a fascinating thing about modern drones, in some ways you fly it, but in a lot of ways you tell it to go left or right and it flies itself based on its GPS connection. Now that gets a little hard in the tropical forest because a lot of times the GPS can't connect down on the ground. So you have to manually basically eyeball it and fly it through small holes in the forest up above the crowns of the trees, up above the top of the forest, and then it connects and it can fly. But so we use a combination of drones. Now there are types of drones that basically you program, they take off from a field or an open area and they fly for maybe a couple hours on their own, and they map forests and come back and basically give you that data. And then there are other ones like we use sometimes when we're looking for an individual tree struck by lightning. We know we're in the right area, but we don't want to spend the 20 hours it might take to find the 20 dead leaves that'll tell us this is the tree that just got struck by lightning. In that instance, what we do is fly the drone through often an area that is not much bigger than the drone, and we lift it out of the canopy, fly around. You can see it on a tablet, what the drone is looking at. You find that damaged tree, take its GPS point, and fly back to where you are. There are professional pilots to do that.
Drone pilots.
Yep, professional drone pilots. There's one we work with quite a bit in Panama on the larger drones, who actually is also he has a pilot's license to fly planes. Now, I've done a lot of our pilot, like our drone flying in other contexts, and somewhat embarrassingly, I can say a lot of that training came from video games as a teenager.
Right. So parents out there, and I have a 17-year-old, when your child wants a gaming computer, right? Don't think it doesn't have not just eye-hand coordination, but strategy and all those good things. Well, that's good, Evan. I think every teenager in the audience, or everyone who has it, will love you, and the people who have teenagers will go, damn, there goes another reason not to have them on
It has been useful, I can say that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that comes out of that answer is mostly you fly them above the ground, so the forest. You don't go through the forest and crash them into trees, although I bet you have some stories about drones you've lost, right?
We haven't lost any, but they haven't always landed gracefully. And then actually, so the question about flying through the canopy is an interesting one. That's not something we can do now. But we know some people developing basically robotic systems where drones could map what's around them, and you could give it a task, say, go get me those leaves, and it will take off from the ground, fly through the forest, grab you the leaves, and come back. all guiding itself using artificial intelligence. And that's not that far off. We're pretty
And
close to
so,
that being
so
reality.
people know there is a long history in tropical forest ecology of collecting fruits and leaves. And the way we used to do it was the way that a very famous ecologist, Peter Ashton, did it in the dipterocarp forests of Southeast Asia, which is he trained a monkey, right, to go into the tree and use voice signals to get the monkey to collect leaves and fruits for him. This sounds a little more elegant. The technology is remarkable, and it's nice to hear that. So somebody wants you to amplify, and we got 6 more minutes. We didn't ask too many questions, and you speak like a New Yorker, even though you're from Pennsylvania. So you're fast. But somebody said, lightning and ice crystals, really? So slowly and carefully, remembering that most of us haven't heard this our whole lives, talk to us about how that actually works.
Yeah, so in sort of really basic terms, your clouds have a lot of moisture in them. Some of it's water, some of it's actually super cooled water, so it's water that's below its freezing point, but still water, and some of it's ice. And essentially, as you have all of these wind gusts blowing around, those 3 types of things start hitting each other. And wind will often, in these clouds, start mixing vertically. Those are a lot of your convective storms. Those are the ones that produce lightning. And as you have these different types of basically frozen and not frozen water hitting each other, some of the smaller pieces end up above the lower pieces. And they have different amounts of electric charge in them because they've been hitting each other. So you get the separation of charge, and then that static shock, instead of going a couple millimeters, goes kilometers, crashes to the earth, and carries a tremendous amount of power with it. And what we see actually is a thing called a return stroke. But what happens is, you have this charge separation. There's a differential basically from the atmosphere to the ground, and this spider web of descending leaders come down, and they'd go in little bursts, jumping down towards the ground. And when they get, about 50, 100 meters from the ground, they attach to an ascending leader from maybe your house. And when that happens, typically the electrons in that channel going all the way up to the sky move upwards like 1 millimeter. And it discharges 30,000 amps in an instant, in a millisecond. And it's this spectacularly powerful event that, that's all it is, just a static shock, and just a millimeter movement of the electrons, but it's a spectacular amount of force.
So like in our high school physics class, or at least 45 years ago in mine, where you have the generator, which you would wind, and then there'd be sparks flying between two poles that had different charges. It's the same thing, except it's vertical, and it's 30,000 amps.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And that's average. I mean, the biggest ones are 300,000 amps again in a millisecond. Just
yeah.
Well,
that is a little bit scary. But
I'm much more scared of them now than before starting this research. I am much more cautious about thunderstorms.
I joked with you the other day that I used to radio track African wild dogs in Zimbabwe, and Southwest Zimbabwe has got really amazing lightning. And there's a challenge because what you want to do is get up high, stand on top of your Land Rover with an antenna. You can't do that in a lightning storm. So I think as we get older and more experienced, it's why we get more cautious, right? And so some of the field biology is probably a young person's sport. And of course, I consider you a young person, but a young person's sport because you haven't figured out that you really shouldn't be doing this yet. All right. There's a question about ecological succession and what stage of the forest. I think you partially, what stage of succession. I think the first thing is we don't always think of forests as a linear succession anymore, right? Forests are patches, and we were talking about patch dynamics. But do you study them? Do you ever study this in secondary forests, which don't have those huge trees in it, and see, as it were, so if we're trying to understand how forests recover and restoration ecology, what the impact of lightning would be in less mature forests is probably the best way to phrase it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good question. So that's one of the next big questions we're answering right now. So we're in the process of setting up a project where we're basically expanding this array I mentioned before, using to track lightning strikes, to all of central Panama. So we're going to look at young forests all across the gradient, from a 4-year-old forest to a 100-year-old forest to a 400-year-old forest. And then this amazing thing about central Panama is there's a huge variation. So The southern end gets about a meter, so about a yard less rain than the northern end, which is staggering because it's 70 kilometers. And it's it's just a spectacular difference in the amount of rainfall. There's a huge difference in the amount of lightning that actually goes like a parallel or an orthogonal direction, like it's not with the rainfall. And then
Right.
there's differences in fertility. So we're asking these questions about the age of the forest and then also the type of forest. So we're starting sort of that next stage now. What are these different types of forests doing? We really don't know the answer right now.
Okay. Well, one of the questions, and it's right behind me, is do you have a book recommendation? I've got behind me Evergreen, Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet. And that's by John Reed and the late Thomas E. Lovejoy, who was a trustee and a colleague and a mentor of mine. And so that's one book, but we'll put other books in when we send out the link. Maybe you could make a couple of recommendations. Another question that someone asked, and I've got my preferences, if you are interested in supporting organizations that do forest conservation, there's the Rainforest Trust, there's the Rainforest Alliance, Wildlife Conservation Society, where I spent 18 years, has a big program in Central Africa. And those are three good ones. Do you have a favorite that I didn't mention, favorite conservation organization? Or
No, I think WCS is a pretty good one. And they have a broad reach. They actually work in a lot of places that
Yep.
not as much work is being done. I think that's important.
I always used to say when I ran that program that we would go places that sane people wouldn't, like northeastern Congo.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, good. Thank you, Evan. That was spectacular. I'm exhausted. I suspect our audience is just full of ideas and information. I want to reiterate that on November 10th at 7, I will be doing this again with Dr. Barbara Hahn. Barbara, for years now, has studied pandemic spillover. It's a topic that I think has a little more valence after almost 3 years of a global pandemic. And she's going to be talking about not how we look at things like what species might SARS-CoV-2 spill into. She's already done that work. She might talk about it a bit, but how do we predict the next pandemic with ecology and artificial intelligence? And Evan, you are a wonderful conversationalist and speaker, and I can say that Barbara is as well. So if you've enjoyed this, please join us. Lori will put the link to that again when we send out the link to this. Finally, thank you all for coming. These virtual webinars have doubled, tripled, or quadrupled our audience from our Friday night at the Carry, which is, we're starting again. We're going to start doing some hybrid meetings. But one of the things I ask, and I don't ask for much, we don't ask anybody to pay for any of our public lectures and tours and field work. But what I would say is, could you send this on to your friends? If you enjoyed this, pass the link around, let people know about this. We are going to keep doing things hybrid and virtual and in real life. And I just ask that you let people know that we exist. We're a quiet organization that doesn't have a big public profile, but we have our friends and we like more friends. I will end with what my job is. If you'd like to support this work, please go to caryinstitute.org. There's a donate button there, or any way you'd like to support us, we'd be grateful. And thank you all for coming tonight. We had a couple hundred people at the peak, and I really appreciate it. And Evan, thanks again. That was spectacular.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
All right, so have a good night, everyone, and a good weekend.